Hello everyone, and this is episode 2 of Drawing Greyhawk Cities, Krakenheim. In the last episode, we were going over shapes and general options for the Krakenheim city, and this that you see on the screen here is generally where we were netting out. TBD, little asterisks, things could change a little bit later on. In this, we're going to tidy up what you're seeing on the screen here a little bit, make it a little less visually obtrusive. But the main thing that I want to cover today with you is the subject of scale. We hear it a lot. People are always, how do you know how big to draw the city or the town, right? And to me, this is not a case of how big you're going to draw it. That's going to be really defined by the size of your paper, right? Really what we should be thinking about is how small are the buildings within this space. And allow me to give you some context. First, let's just click on our trace layer there and kind of give that a little bit of transparency, just to kind of get it sitting in the background. I think of this, by the way, as pencil marks, okay? Even when I did ink on paper, I would start with a pencil, sketch out the rough shape. You could erase it later on. I do the same digitally, and you can too. Get your rough shape in on one layer, whatever program you're using. Trace over it later on with more accurate ink, in inverted commas. Work. That said, scale. Let me give you some examples. So let's give ourselves a proper drawing brush here, something like this. Not so obnoxiously large, maybe sort of 15. Okay, so if we're talking about sizes of buildings and how they impact things, let me do some examples here. Let's do a throwaway layer. If our buildings were kind of like this big, and I'm drawing like crude here, obviously, cut me some slack, governor, but you can see if we're drawing buildings this big, and look at some little sort of thatch pattern on the top there, that is not going to be a town, right? This is like a village at most. And you can see that because what is your brain doing now? You're kind of looking at these buildings and you're kind of thinking, well, maybe there's 4 to 6 people in each one of these buildings. I'm maybe looking at a population of something maybe like 18, 20, 36 maybe tops people right there. If you then blow that up there, maybe we've got 70 people. Now we've got do math, Baden, 140. You get a general, 140 there. You get a general idea. We're talking small village right here at most. So what if I did this instead? What if I this music is not copyrighted, by the way. Well, now I've just crammed the same amount of people into a much smaller space. They're not smaller people, they're not smaller buildings. The scale has changed. We've gone from something like that, let's say being 40 feet across, to something like that being 40 feet across. Can you see that? Whee! Right down there. So now if I was to take this over and over and over again, I'm now populating this much more densely. Now, if you watched the Wantham development, you're going to see I did a similar thing. And I basically drew the size of the building I thought should be my standard. And that becomes like a sketch scale that I always visually go back to. Let me show you what I mean. So, Krakenheim is about 4,500 people. Okay, let's just keep that in mind. In fact, let's just draw that up at the top here so we've got that as a reference. If we say, in fact, you know what? This stuff in the background here is let's just get rid of that and let's get rid of these because it's only going to confuse the subject. Okay, if we say that a building, and let's just draw, in fact, let's just draw it a little bit more on a flat curve here. Say that this building here is a population of 6. Why 6? Well, we're talking about a fantasy setting. Let's say it doesn't matter if it's early medieval, dark ages, or earlier. Odds on, it's going to be more than your, 3.2 or whatever, an average sort of family size is in this day and age. It's going to be a little bit bigger. All being well. Maybe, okay, I mean, the children are going to be working on the farm as much as anyone else, right? But they're going to probably be in the realm of maybe 6, maybe 8, maybe more. But let's say there's an average of 6 people in a building. That said, some of our buildings, you've seen me draw them, right? I'll draw like this type of weird shape. And I've always said, I'm basically doing an abstract of rooftops. And you can think of it in terms of, maybe it's something more like this. Well, a building like this has probably got more like 18, 20 or so people in it. Also, that type of building, if we were to look at it front on, might be multi-story. Less so in Krakenheim. Keep that in mind. So the type of thing where we can have a multi-story building, multi-family building, and the type where we have these shapes that can be more than 6 people in them, we need to keep that in mind. Likewise, we have other things where maybe we're drawing a temple and there's no one living in that, right? So we can have more and we can have less, but let's assume that it's an average of 6. Let's agree upon that. So if our average model is 6, then we can do some simple math and say 4,500 people divided by 6 would be the number of buildings we would need in our city. But don't do that. Okay, don't take the next logical step, which is to then say, okay, so I'm going to have to draw something in the region of, X amount of hundreds of buildings. You will be there forever, not only drawing them, but literally counting them and recounting them and recounting them as you try to dial in the perfect amount of buildings. You don't need to do that. You need to just visually imply and get the general sense and balance for how many people live here. So the way I do it is a little bit simpler. If we say that there's 6 people here and I was to multiply this by 10, then I'm going to get obviously 60 people if I obviously did 10 of those buildings. Well, conversely, if I also did 100 of them, i.e. a 10 by 10 grid, then I've got 600 people approximately living in that space, give or take. So let's do that. Let's take this little building that we've got here, and let's there we go. Let's grab this and what I'm doing is I am just grabbing 10 of those across, and then we are going to get 10 of these north and south, so to speak. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, in fact, you know what? Let's not do that one. There we go. Oops, don't want that. We want this. So I've got 50 buildings there right now. That's 300 people. You can see where I'm going with this, hopefully. So if I now take this, there's 600 people right there. Now, what we'll want to do is, I'm going to bring up my calc, okay? I'm bringing up my calculator. So if we've got 4,500 people, oops, not 45,000, we've got 4,500 people, we need how many units of 100? Well, we know that's going to be 45, right? But I want to think of this a little bit differently here. How many families do we need? 750. So that's 750 buildings, right? Let's just say about 7 of these. About 7 of these. So, I am now going to make this smaller. And what I'm going to do is say, okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe about 7. Maybe about 7 right there. In other words, if I shrink my buildings to about this size, like 1, we're going to have some here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe a little bit smaller. That here becomes the size of my buildings. 7 lots of, well, actually 7 lots of 100 times 6 families. Let's make sure I did that right. So we do 7 times 100 buildings times 6, 4,200. That's going to be close enough. That is going to be close enough. So I'm going to zoom in now. How does this translate? Well, my average building size should be about this. I can go larger and I can go a little smaller. But if I draw my buildings approximately this size and come back to this occasionally as my scale, like I'm going to keep this as my building scale. If I do something like this, it's going to feel like there's over 3,500 people in Krakenheim. This becomes my model. Again, I'll do larger, like, you know, if I want to do a longhouse now, maybe we end up doing this, or even a big, huge block. But this then becomes my standard for a medium-sized building. I can do a larger one. Maybe it's 4 of these together. I could do just 1 and a garden outside of it. But you can see now, I don't need a scale bar. I need my building size. And by the way, I did that back even on the light harbour map that I drew for Noble Dwarf. And I did a small, medium and large building. And you saw me do it on one of them too. And then I can draw, check my visual scale, come back and start drawing some more. Again, this becomes my standard. If we now apply this, we end up with, okay, so on the front of the harbour, maybe we do a little sort of building about this sort of size here, maybe with a little sort of shed here, and then, you know, we'll do a little sort of building going in that orientation, and a building with slightly different shape on this orientation, but these are approximately the right scale. I know that there's about 18 people living here, and if I apply that to the overall map, with maybe a little bit of spill out, but something like that, it will give me about the right size. Now, you may be asking, yeah, but you're going to have roads in between, you're going to have a lot of dead space. Trust me, as long as you stay roughly in the hemisphere of this visual building scale, the overall settlement will feel right. It will visually have that level of building density that you want. That said, if, let's say, we were drawing something that was light in density, because maybe they had a lot of internal farming or cattle or something, and maybe this will, we might want to go a little bit smaller on these, or spill over to the other side, you know, a little bit. I don't want to do too much of that. I want to keep most of it internal in here. But this, again, becomes that model. And if you're a little bit concerned because you need to go lighter, then, okay, make them a little bit smaller accordingly. But this will be a good starting point for us. Especially because I know me, by the way. I tend to sort of draw sort of like this quite a bit. But then I end up doing a lot of small buildings, you know, and also like double density buildings and things like that. And knowing that I do that, I know that the net result will look about 4,000 people live here. And that's what we're shooting for. So I'm going to get rid of this layer right here. So this will be my scale. Let's actually label that up. Building scale. The next thing that we're going to do is actually start inking in some of these details here. But you're going to have to join me on the next video to see that. If you would like to see this progress on more of a blow-by-blow nature and a written supplement to it, please check out my Patreon. I'm actually doing these free of charge for Greyhawk Online and the Earth Journal. So they get an exclusive once a quarter with these maps. However, my Patreons also get blow-by-blow, progress reports, and the full high-resolution images and Photoshop files right at the same time as the Earth Journal and Greyhawk Online. So if you like what I'm doing here, if you want to see me do more Greyhawk City maps, please consider backing me on my Patreon. Otherwise, hit the video up with a like, hit me with some comments down below. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. What are your techniques for actually determining the scale of your maps? And I will see you on episode 3 of Drawing Greyhawk Cities. Night, folks.